So I think, I thank you both for coming, and I'm looking forward to learning from you. So thank you.
Yeah, so it's kind of to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Give me 1 second as I load up my presentations, okay?
Share the slides too.
Is it being?
I don't think it's shared now.
Sure.
So let's see. This one.
Yeah. Okay.
Just everyone see the screen.
Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes, but it's not in presentation mode. That's
All
better.
right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started then. My name is Lukman Baloch. I was fortunate enough to graduate from UIC, the College of Medicine, in 2017. I was at the Chicago campus. I did my residency in North Carolina, and I did a chief year at Mercy Health. And I was lucky enough to work with Dr. Linta Ramachandran, along with other wonderful residents, and stayed on as faculty, and currently have the position of assistant program director. It's my understanding we're speaking with first year and second year medical students. Possibly some of you have already published prior to coming into medical school. When I started, I had 0 publications. And by the time I graduated medical school, I had 1 abstract publication, but I did not write it. All I did was do Western blots at the College of Medicine research building. And one of the attendings I was working with was kind enough to include me in the actual publication because of my work. So hopefully today will help everybody talk about the process of writing a case report and an abstract. So there are several types of publications. We're obviously going to be focusing on doing case reports. There are obviously a case report, which we also call a clinical Vernier. These are often seen in national and regional competitions, and also publications in big journals. There's also smaller journals that you can also publish to that are online. And then there's quality improvement projects that you could typically publish. And then there's research projects as well. There's also textbook publications that you could pursue. But we're going to talk about case reports. So when you're applying for residency, you will be going through the ERAS application. And if you go through the application and you look at the scholarly work section, it's actually going to be listed like this. There'll be sections of peer reviewed journal articles / abstracts. There'll be sections for those that are not published but might be in press at this point. And then peer reviewed book chapters, a scientific monograph, poster presentations, oral presentations, etc. But when it comes to writing a case report, the first thing you have to do really is choosing a case. And there's no scientific formula when it comes to choosing a case. Really, there's no such thing as a bad case either. You oftentimes, when you're going to be on clinical rotations, ideally, you're going to be seeing patients with an attending or a resident or someone to teach you as well. And they're going to also give you their opinions on whether or not they believe this is something that could be published, presented at a national conference, talked about on grand rounds, etc. So there's no such thing as a bad case. You could even publish something as simple as acute gout and still get a publication out of it. What's very important when you're actually looking up a case, whether or not it's worth your time in writing it up, before you begin writing, you have to do a literature review. What I mean by that is, if I go back to the example of gout, and it's a fairly unique presentation of gout, hypothetically, caused by certain types of crystalloid deposits that are not common and something that you probably read in step 1, but you've never seen it clinically before, and it's a rare case and a rare cause of gout or pseudo-gout. That's something you would have to look up. You'd have to see how common, how rare this presentation is, and that's what I mean by doing the literature review. Know the data behind what this case is about, and potentially you can have a spin towards the uniqueness factor of this case. And so ideally, you have something that's unique and interesting, but you don't know until you do a lit review. And so that's the point I'm trying to make. Also, anything that's a rare presentation, either a rare diagnosis, some clinical manifestation, a rare clinical manifestation of a disease. So most recently, we had a resident that submitted a case for gallstone pancreatitis, but that patient had so many complications associated with the procedure that they had after cholecystectomy and all of that. It ended up being a great publication. So you could have, again, run-of-the-mill cases like pancreatitis or gout that could be interesting in the way they manifested and therefore are definitely worthy of a publication. And then when it comes to the overall point I'm trying to make is, again, no case is a bad case. So after you decide this is a case that you're going to look into, you see that something is unique that you can actually potentially write up, you're going to decide, well, where the heck do I submit this to? You could submit it to regional conferences, national conferences, a variety of different medical societies. There's literally a medical society for every part of the body. I cannot tell you how many we have in just the United States, but there are several throughout the world. It could be an online medical journal. It could be a printed medical journal. If you're looking at these larger journals, you're going to want to know something called impact factor. Impact factor is very important because down the road, you're going to decide, well, if I submit to this journal, more people are going to see it versus this other journal where nobody really reads this journal. And it's probably important for me to get the best possible journal I could get. And then whether or not there's PubMed indexing, which basically means whether or not your publication, once published, will be available for people to see on PubMed. And obviously, there's a cost of every publication that you do. There are some low-cost options that are available. If anyone wants resources, I'll go ahead and definitely email those out. But in general, when you look at large medical societies, you can see here, this is just all the medical societies that begin with the letter A that are under internal medicine. I mean, there's one for GI, there's one for pulmonary critical care, rheumatology, etc. So every specialty under the sun has a society, has an organization, and conferences yearly that both local and national chapters that have competitions for you to potentially submit to, and have journals that they frequently make. And in fact, they have multiple journals that you could potentially submit to. So these are potential options when it comes to where you want to submit. Why does impact factor matter? So impact factor is obviously the measured frequency of how many times an article actually gets cited. Basically, the higher the impact factor, the higher the ranking, even by these medical societies, your publication really would be. And when it comes to your goals, why you're trying to publish this, maybe you want something that has a higher impact factor so more people can see it, so that you can potentially go into whatever subspecialty or residency you wish to go into. What are the costs of publication? This was a rude awakening. When I realized how expensive it is to get things published as a resident, man, I was really upset. On average, it's anywhere between $2,500 to $4,500, depending on the publishing company the journals actually use. So very commonly, Elsevier is a publishing company. One example that I could think of was they represent the American Journal of Gastroenterology and the Clinical and Transitional Gastroenterology Journal as well. On average, you're going to be paying over $2,000 for those submissions. Just to have, once it gets accepted, you're expected to pay this. And this is for open access so that people can just search online. Those that actually have access to these journals online, they'll be able to actually read your work. And then there's also other publishing companies like the American Heart Association, and there's a variety of different pricing options that are available, as you can see here. So these are just some examples. So step 3, when it comes to the actual submissions, Every journal, unfortunately, has its own requirements. Every abstract will have its own requirements, depending on whether it's a research abstract or a case report or a quality improvement project. Whatever you're trying to publish and wherever you're trying to publish it to will have different requirements. So I hope I can actually click into this, and I'll have to share the screen. But one example, I'm going to just use ACPs. Okay, so I'm just going to be sharing the screen here, so that should be easier. So one example is there's a ACP National Abstract Competition. For anyone interested in internal medicine, this is a great competition for medical students, residents, fellows, and even doctors that are recent graduates. You can actually look at their abstract categories at this national competition. The deadline was obviously December 1st of 2021. They're going to be having the competition actually in Chicago. It talks about later in 2022 in Chicago. And they actually have eligibility requirements. So it mentions that you have to be a medical student, a resident, a fellow, or an early career physician, and it has to be in good standing. And oftentimes that requires a letter either from your medical school or the training program that you're at to verify that you're in good standing. Ideally, they should be ACP members, and then it has other details about the abstracts that are listed there. So there's basic research abstracts, clinical research abstracts. We're obviously going to go ahead and click into clinical Vernier, which is another term for case reports. And these are all the different categories you could potentially submit to if you had something to actually submit by December 1st of last year. But at the same time, going back to the presentation, there are certain individual requirements that are listed for each individual type of abstract that you're writing. And so going to the clinical Vernier section, it literally lays out for you how exactly you want to write your abstracts for a case presentation. So it talks about for the title and author information, how you should potentially name. It talks about the introduction, the case description, the discussion, etc. And then here's another one that's a little bit more complicated, is JAMA's instructions for authors, and this is for research publications. And if you scroll down, it talks about if you have an original investigation type of research, if you have a research letter, if you're doing a systemic review without a meta-analysis, if you're doing a narrative review, etc. And all of these have different requirements. So before you begin writing, the point I'm trying to make, before you begin writing, very important, you know where you're submitting to and what the requirements are. Now, when it actually comes to writing the abstract, typically 90% of case report abstracts are going to have an introduction, a case description, and a discussion. The introduction is typically very short. You can describe the context of the case, and you can explain its relevance and importance, but you just have to do this briefly. I'm talking about maybe 1 to 3 sentences at the most. You could even skip the introduction section when it comes to writing these, because typically you have a word count limit of 500 words, and you're trying to get this into a competition where there's hundreds of other applicants, obviously, and there are several doctors that are reviewing these. It would be wise for you to keep it short, specifically for the introduction. When it comes to the case description, you should always start with that relevant one-liner. Do not write your case description and your write-ups like the way doctors write their notes. The shorthand text that we end up using, it's not formal, and this is something that potentially is going to be published and presented at a large national conference, so it has to be formally written. When you do use acronyms, you should use things that are common, like CBC, CT, IV. These are, intravenous or computed topography scans. And you don't need to write out the full CT. You can just literally write CT, abdomen, pelvis showed the following. And then for uncommon acronyms, I mean, I've had a few patients that had chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, but I don't think I would know if you just threw CIDP in my face and asked me what it was, I would have to probably Google it. So uncommon acronyms, the first time you use them, you should write them fully out, and then you should put them in parentheses. And then thereafter, for the rest of the write-up, you could use CIDP to minimize your word count. Whenever you're talking about lab abnormalities, you need to always mention the units. So if I say the hemoglobin was 6 grams per deciliter, I have to write the actual unit, because potentially this is online. When you go to Europe or you go to other parts of the world, they're using different units. And if you said a hemoglobin of 6, they might find that to be profoundly low, versus the hemoglobin here, that is still low in the United States with the measurements that we use, but still you should always have units to give context to what you're trying to say. Never mention protected health information, no names, no date of births, no social security numbers, no addresses, zip codes, etc. Do not mention specific locations, do not mention the time, do not mention dates, and try your best to present the facts objectively and go in an order of the events as they lay out forward. And if you do that, then you can move on to the discussion. And this is really how, this is a section where you want to justify that uniqueness factor of your case. You want to make sure that you talk about your findings in your lit review, that unique complication of pancreatitis, of gallstone pancreatitis I was talking about, and a complication of cholecystectomy. You can talk about how many cases there actually are of this reported event happening. And you can talk about how your case is actually unique. And then in the end, tie it into what this submission is trying to teach everybody else. Overall, that's the best process to writing a case report. And hopefully, if you do this, things will get accepted. This is a little bit of what to do when you have a research project or a quality improvement project. The main difference, and I'm going to briefly touch this for the sake of time, but the main difference really is when it comes to the methods and the results. You really want to explain the methods of your project. Extremely important to explain the intervention, if you had an intervention, and talk about all the variables you looked at, and explain the way you analyze things, what statistical methods you actually use, and talk about your exclusion and exclusion criteria. But those are the main differences between the two. So I do have a few examples. So this is an example of a case report that we had someone submit a while back. And I remember the title literally was Pancreatitis 2/2 CFTR. Does anyone understand what that means? I do, because that's shorthand that doctors use for medical documentation. So it means pancreatitis due to CFTR. That's it. That's all it means. So there's a brief introduction, which is good, right? There's the shorthand that typically that we end up using. So this is 35-year-old female. It's not mentioning the past medical history. She came in with left-sided abdominal. So what I would do is when I review these, I go back and I actually, in order to make this formal, I go back and I will write year-old female and I will write past medical history and write out everything, essentially, right? And then how it says L-sided, it means left-sided. I will write out alcohol. I will write out nausea, vomiting. I will write out all the uncommon acronyms. CT is totally fine to use. PRN means as needed. NPO means nothing per os, meaning nothing by mouth. IV fluids for the most part is okay. That's a relatively common acronym that we end up using. And then it does mention the patient's vitals were stable, and it mentioned she had leukocytosis, and it also mentions, I believe there's a triglyceride level here, but I don't have units. So in reality, I don't know what that means. All in all, this was a great write-up, but it really needed to be edited. And so following the I would say formal methodology in writing, this would have to go back for revision, and it would be automatically rejected if it was submitted like this. So they mentioned that the patient was DC'd, meaning discharged, and it's mentioning dates. None of that is appropriate. So this would be an example of an abstract that definitely needs revision. And then as we go down, it talks about the CFTR mutation potentially causing this patient's pancreatitis. Our patient did not show other signs of pancreatitis. And then it says, I believe this mutation cannot be excluded as a cause of her a complicated course of pancreatitis. But then it would be wise to go back and see what the actual data says. What does my lit review say about this specific mutation and pancreatitis? And so this would be someone that needs work. This was a great write-up by one of our residents at Mercy Health. It's a simple case. I mean, I've seen, I don't know how many COVID patients since the pandemic started. And I've seen these patients develop something called pneumomediastinum or pneumothoraxes, and they require chest tubes, etc. But the way this was written was really well. And it talked about other, the theory behind, and there's a significant lit review behind this, but it talked about the theory behind the mechanism in which a person could potentially have a pneumomediastinum from a COVID infection. And so it mentions it right here. The exact pathophysiology mechanism is not known, but some studies theorize that increased alveolar pressure, increased risk of rupture, especially when patients often have prominent cough. And so this is a great write-up here where it's talking about even, it has all the units that we actually need, and it's sweet, short, and to the point. And this is another write-up that was written by one of our residents as well. It essentially is written in a formal fashion. It talks about again, using units when talking about the thickness of the esophagus, for example. It was talking about, it's using CO2, which is a very commonly used acronym. It's using, when it's talking about the CO2 measurements, it's giving the actual units. So I wanted to show a couple examples, and I'll gladly share them with you all so that you can take a look at them, so that when you're writing your first case report, the bottom two, you can model off of the last two that I just showed, and ideally avoid the mistakes of the very first one that I showed you. And then this is a recently published case report by Dr. Ramachandran, actually. He was able to get it published at Baylor University's Medical Center Proceedings. He did have an image right here. Dr. Ramachandran, how much did that cost you?
$150 per image.
This is one of the cheaper, lower cost journals that we were aware of, and which is why Dr. Ramachandran chose to submit it there. And he really wanted the picture, and because of that, picture's worth 1,000 words, obviously, and it costs $150 just to get that picture in. But you can see here, this is a full case report where he's talking about the units of the platelet counts, the white cells, the hemoglobin, etc., and talking about different things like the ADAM-TS level. This is a commonly used acronym. If you don't know what that is, I promise you will learn it when you learn more about hematology. But he also italicized organisms like the way we do when reading medical texts. So, and then he is talking about something called immune thrombocytopenic purpura, which we call ITP for short. And you can see he has the very first time he mentions it, he listed that he actually types it out, and then he uses the acronym, and you're allowed to use the acronym thereafter. So again, ITP here, okay? So these are small little tips that I hope are helpful. And then in his discussion, he talks about quite a bit of what the literature tells us. And he has citations as to what the literature is stating. He's talking about several different studies, several different mechanisms in which ITP could be caused by an organism called H. pylori. So really well written case presentation here. And again, you notice this is a lot longer than the first three that I showed you. And that's because at Baylor University, their medical proceedings, they had a different word count. And so they wanted us to maintain a word count. And they wanted the abstract portion to be very, very small, a summary, very, very small with a summary. So things will be different depending on where you submit them to. So overall, no case is a bad case. Do your lit review and talk about it. Try to find a uniqueness factor and choose where you want to submit your case to. Read those submission requirements for the publication, begin writing, and tailor that writing to those requirements, and always recycle what you write. So if you submitted something to Baylor Medical Proceedings and it doesn't get accepted, well, go ahead and try submitting somewhere else. And if that doesn't work, submit somewhere else. If that doesn't work, submit it to a place that's doing the medical conference instead of a publication. You can always recycle what you write, okay? Does anyone have questions? For the, I guess the folks at home, maybe.
Is that you mentioned costs, and I was just wondering, as a medical student, can't we receive some type of gratis or something like that? Is there a procedure for that we need to follow directly with the said journal that we're trying to publish in, or how would one go about to do that?
So I can take that one. So submit to these case report journals, they really don't care as long as the real discretion of data, unless you're from a country that it does not have, it really doesn't change. So, sorry. You guys all hear me? So yeah, unfortunately, there is no leeway specifically for students. For a lot of times, the conferences and things, they'll give you discounted pricing. But the only thing that these journals look for is, unless you're from a country that's going through poverty and things, otherwise you get the same price as a medical student or a resident or an attending even. And the prices that Dr. Baloch pulled up earlier, unfortunately, that is the scale of prices. And I'll talk a little bit more about pricing in my part of the talk as well. So that'll answer things a little bit better as well.
Sometimes you get a discount if the attending you're working with or anyone that's part of the case is a member of that society, and it could be a difference of $500-600, which is quite a bit of money. This was the tough part about publishing things. Usually larger institutions actually will cover the cost for that. Or when people that are conducting research, or any pharmaceutical study that's conducting research, they definitely budget according to the publication costs as well, which for big pharma obviously is not that much. But for someone who is a struggling medical student, living on debt, unfortunately, it's every penny counts. And so it's important to find low-cost journals like the one that Dr. Ramchandran also submitted to. And there are many out there, and we'll definitely share those resources. A while back, I did share a list with the research department. I don't know if that was given to you all, but I will gladly share that again, okay? Of course. There's another question that Kelsey asked. Do you have to get IRB approval for a case report or the patient's approval? Every case you submit, you should be asking, at least verbally, from the patient that you're going to publish about. You're not going to disclose, obviously, patient health information that will identify them, but 99% of the time, I've had patients say yes. I've honestly never heard of an instance where a patient said no. So there should be no reason why you should not ask the patient. If they are potentially deceased, you could ask family members as well. And again, oftentimes they know that this is our learning process, and 90% of the time, 99% of the time, they will say yes. Do you need to get an IRB approval for a case report? Technically, no, you do not need an IRB approval, but every institution is different. If you're using a patient from Mercy Health, you have to run your submission prior to submission, your actual write-up, you have to run it by the IRB department. And basically they send it over to our privacy screeners, our privacy officers, and they just make sure no patient health information is present. And so it depends. You need to follow whichever institution you're at, wherever that patient is, you need to follow those guidelines. And then there's a question from Adrian. Can you have the same case report published in multiple journals? If so, is there a limit to how many publications are acceptable? So every journal, just like every journal has different requirements, every journal has different statements regarding duplications. 90% of them will tell you if you've submitted this and it's been accepted at X, Y, and Z, if it's been accepted or if it's an online open access journal that people can very easily access, and we will not be taking it. So 90% of them will state that. However, if you have an abstract that you wrote of a case and you submitted it, for example, to ACP and it got accepted and you presented, and even if you were the first place winner and you received an award, etc., when you go back to write the full manuscript, which is longer, not just the abstract, you can submit that to another journal because technically the actual full manuscript was never accepted. This is even though it's about the same case, it goes into more detail, and technically it's a different write-up. But the same abstract, for example, I remember when I was a resident, every year we had Society of Hospital Medicine that our program director would encourage us to submit to. I was interested in, I am still interested in hepatology. And at the time I wanted to send it over to one of the liver conferences that we have. I was also interested in sending it to the GI conferences, and I wanted to send it to ACP. And because the deadlines were back to back to back, where the results for all of these institutions would not be, the results for the actual acceptance would not be sent out to me before the deadlines of any of these institutions and these competitions, I submitted to all 4. And 3 out of 4 accepted. So that year I went to 3 different conferences presenting 2 different cases. So it's definitely allowable, but if it's been accepted and it's the same exact write-up, 90% of the time, you're not allowed to reproduce it. And if you have questions, you can always contact the individual journal or the individual competition and society contact email, and they will give you further information about it. Any other questions? So Hamza is asking, is there an average length of time it takes for a journal to respond to a submission request, particularly if they reject the case report? It really depends on, I mean, that's like, how busy are they really? So I remember you and I had a submission that we submitted to the American College of Gastroenterology case reports. And they got back what, like after a month, we found out that they didn't want it.
Yeah.
So it did take some time. But when you went with JAMA, they responded what, like within 2 weeks?
2 days even. 2
2 days. So it depends on the journal. Unfortunately, I don't have a solid answer to your question. But again, if you go on that, they will most likely give you that information. They'll tell you their turnaround time. All right, so I'm 5 minutes over. So we're going to give it to Dr. Ramachandran, okay? Thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you very much, Luckman.
Is the slide sharing on?
I was sharing the whole screen, so hopefully it should be.
Oh, I got you. Yeah, I know. Thank you. So how's
There we
everyone
go.
doing? You guys doing good? Okay. So my name is Dr. Ramachandran, which most people can pronounce, so I go by Dr. Ram. Or if you're one of the nurses in the Mercy Hospital, there's ramen noodles, Ramchada, so all sorts of names they call me by as well. I'll accept both of those as well. I've had the fortunate pleasure of working with Dr. Baloch quite a bit, and he's helped me a lot in my case reporting career and things like that. But there's a few things that over and over happens, and we'll talk about that too. But before I get to it, why is it important for you guys to submit case reports? Why does it matter? Well, NRP statistics show that it matters. 78% of medical students did some sort of research at some point in their before they matched. Average case reports have actually increased from 2.2 in 2009, and I think this was about 3 years ago. It was 5.8. Not all case reports, abstracts, posters, everything's included in that as well. And also it helps you with making relations, because that is at the end of the day, getting into residency is part of that too. You have strong relationship with attending, strong relationship with faculty or program directors. It's a way in for you guys to get to the place that you want to get to as well. And also, studies show that medical students who did research prior to getting into residency are actually stronger residents. And not just first year, even in their second years, they're actually stronger residents than the people who did not do research at baseline. So before I talk about my journal specifically, I want to talk to you guys about how this came about and how this kind of played out as well. So as he said before, I'm a third-year resident. I'm actually in neurocritical care in Baylor, so I'll be heading to Texas in June. Before I started residency, I had maybe 3 posters, and most of them were regional posters. I was in New Jersey for a bit, so I had 2 posters there, and I did a psychiatry poster. Those are the only thing. I had very little research to begin with. So I took it upon myself, my residency year, first year, to do as many case reports as I can, do as much research as I can. And like I said, I met him, so he actually encouraged me in that as well. So now I have about 12 case reports, 19 abstracts, about 8 poster presentations, 3 research projects that's still printing. So you can see how significant of a difference it is. Part of it is what you make of it. You have to want to do these things, obviously. But every time I try to submit these things, there's a few things that I noticed. One, the cost. The cost is one of the biggest things for me. The journals charge anywhere from $250 to $9,000. And if you look at Nature over, the open access Nature is 9,500 pounds. That's about $11,000. To me, as a medical student, or even as a resident, even some attending, I don't think can afford that per article. That's an insanely high amount. Another one of Oxford Medical case reports, about $1,090 per case report. I really strongly felt that as a student and a resident, that is almost an absolutely crazy number. So the other part of it is one of the questions actually as well. How long does it take for them to get your feedback? Well, the acceptance time could be more than 3 months. The publication time could be 9 to 12 months. And even when they reject you, it's a standard generic letter you get saying, hey, unfortunately, we were not able to accept your case report. How does that help anyone? It doesn't help you with improving your case report. It doesn't help you with improving your case report. You can accept it another time or accepting it in a different journal. So these are things that happen in multiple submissions and multiple journals. Personally happened to me as well. There's no reasonable feedback. So the question then becomes what to do about it. So I sat down and thought about it and talked to multiple people. And I had this idea of starting my own journal. So if you start your own journal, and I also decided to call it dossier, which actually is the Latin word for doctor. It also means teacher in Latin as well. And then I decided that I'm only going to charge $50, and I want to focus it mainly for students and residents, particularly. Well, and then I also said, what else can I do to kind of help residents and students with this as well? So I specifically went out of my way to create specific templates, and I'll show you some of these templates as well. These templates highlight exactly where the things need to go, exactly what each section encompasses, how many words, how many references, how to cite the references as well. In the next couple of slides, you guys will see the actual template as well. Well, we still had a problem here. So who's going to review the article? Because everything needs to be peer reviewed. A peer reviewed journal is much more important than any other journal. Non-peer reviewed journals are not really looked upon. So I went to my first attending, Dr. Vernier, who also happens to be a PhD doctor as well. I asked him, hey, what do you think about helping me review some case reports as these things come along? He said, absolutely no problem at all. So I asked a second attending, Dr. Patel, who's at Mercy as well. He said wholeheartedly, there's no hesitancy, they all said yes. Then I said, you know what, we need some consultants as well. So I asked the GI doctor, Dr. Dawood. He absolutely said, no, unquestionably yes. And then Dr. Nara, who's a cardiologist at Mercy as well. And I ended up asking about 30 different people, and every single one of them said yes. Most of them are from Mercy. Some of them are also not from Mercy as well. And Dr. Baloch was also nice enough to say yes as well. There's pictures on there as well. And here's the template I was talking about. You guys can literally see that first page on the left side is a title page. It tells you where the title goes, where the author's names go, corresponding authors and details, the financial disclosure statement, if you have no financial disclosure to disclose, the keywords, and on the other side, it actually shows the abstract, shows you the introduction, and specifically give you the details of things you should put in there. So relevant background information. And the case report part, a lot of the things Dr. Baloch highlighted, do not forget to include details such as history, do not forget units. All those are mentioned there as well as a reminder. And you go down further down to the reference section, it tells you reference 1, reference 2, do not exceed how many references. And they should appear in the order of where you cite them, and they should be the AMA style as well. And I did this for all types of articles that we accept. So right now we're planning on accepting original research, case reports, something called reflections, and clinical images. The original research is prospective studies or retrospective studies. Those will be a little bit harder for you guys at Chicory to kind of take off at this point. But case reports is something I should definitely be focusing on. And 1,500 words should be plenty enough, and the 20 references should be accomplishable. Reflections is more so has to do with the social aspect of things. It's not necessarily the medical part of things, it's other things that make things challenging. One type of article I can kind of think about is how COVID has impacted patients who are deaf. So when deaf patients get COVID, they usually lip read. How has that impacted the care? So more so this non-medical aspect of things. Another article I've seen recently on JAMA was a physician's relationship with his pager. He was an old physician who's been practicing for several years. The day he had to give up on his pager and do electronic paging. It was an interesting article. So things like that would go into reflections. And last but not least, clinical images. These are the most easiest of these articles. Any sort of image that you think is interesting, a chest x-ray, a CT, an IR procedure that you saw, or even an open wound or some sort of specific skin disease that you saw. And all they will need is 500 words on top of that as well, reflecting what you're describing exactly what you saw. So how does the workflow for the article itself work? Well, first things first, you submit it, and then an editor like myself or one of the other residents will actually look at it for the correction for the grammar, the structure, and the content of it. And there's really 3 choices throughout the entire thing. We'll either accept it to the next phase, or we'll return it to you, say, please edit these things. For example, when Dr. Baloch showed you one of the articles that did not have any of the units, or did not have the PMH or the abbreviations that were inappropriate, those would be returned to you saying, hey, please fix these errors. What I'm hoping to do at least, if I'm the editor, I would tell you, these are the things you need to fix. So it'll be somewhat of a learning opportunity for you guys as well. And last but not least, if it is so terrible to a point where there's nothing to do, then we will reject those as well. But I'm trying to not do as little of those as I can. And then the second part would be reviewers. Well, for the reviewers, you show the pictures of the reviewers. So it'll go to 3 reviewers. As long as 2 out of the 3 reviewers say the content makes sense, this is appropriate, and this will be a great addition to the journal, then we'll go ahead and accept it. And then comes the last little bit where we look at the typesetting, the formatting, and then that'll be the publication fee. Like I said, I did not intend to charge more than $50 per article. And everything that basically you guys will be paying is basically for the domain and the registration and the hosting of the journal itself. Really, I'm not going to make any money on it, honestly. So current plans, we're going to register with ISSN, which is a standard for every journal. So we'll get those. We will have Google Scholar indexing and ResearchGate indexing as well. We're also planning for PubMed indexing. We're setting it up in a way that down the road we can get PubMed indexing. Trouble with PubMed indexing, you have to be in circulation for about a year or 2 before you get PubMed indexing. So I'm not able to get PubMed indexing. If I could, I would. Unfortunately, I'll have to wait a little bit. We're also working on a system to submit things. Right now, the way it works is it's just an email. You download the template, fill out the template, you email it to me, and on the website, it's there as well. Sooner or later, by March, what we're hoping is there will be a full-on submission system where you as an author can log in and submit it. Me as the editor can log in the same system, give you feedback, and the reviewer also can log in the same system and make the changes, or kind of like a Google Docs kind of outlook of that as well. And that will help, I think, ease things, the workflow and things like that as well. So our team, right now we have mainly 3 people that's on the backbone of this. There's me, there's Dr. Jerde, who's a 30-year resident who just mentioned nephrology at WashU. He's going to serve as a preliminary editor as well. And Dr. Killeru, who some of you guys will actually work with in the future. He's an interventional cardiologist at Mercy. He'll serve as the editor-in-chief as well. That's actually my PowerPoint, guys. Any questions about it so far?
Lintu, it's Jeff Smith here. I have a question.
Yeah, hey, Dr. Smith, go ahead.
Thanks for your presentation. I went to the website a week or two ago and enjoyed looking around in there. If I understand correctly, you haven't had any publications on the website yet, and when do you expect to have them?
So ideally, I would like to get them going in March. By March is my deadline. For us to get the ISSN number, we have to have the first journal have at least five publications. So March is our goal for the first issue to be published.
Excellent. And can you give us an idea of how many submissions you've had so far?
So this is the first time I'm actually presenting in general, the journal to begin with. So I actually haven't had any submissions yet. That being said, the next presentation is going to be to the Mercy class. And there's about eight articles at least that's pending that will probably be coming my way.
Excellent. So people who are already working on their articles, they've already started the process. They can submit them to your journal.
Yep. I'm trying to see if there's any questions on this as well.
Are you trying to see the chat?
Yeah, sorry. No questions here.
I just want to add something to it, and that is like when you are trying to write a case report, we on our campus we have a research day, and there is a category, special category for case report. So you can basically submit an article over there, an abstract, a poster over there, and then submit an article. So basically you can have a look at your
All right, guys. Thank you guys for your time.
Thank you both very much. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. Dr. Matthews, thanks for putting this on along with us, and I wish you all a good afternoon.
Thank you.